I was invited to speak in my capacity as a legal expert. That's why I wear the collar and tie, so that you can see that I'm an expert from far away and with glasses. It's a warm room, beautiful sunny day. You've had a lot of heavy discussion earlier, and I'm not going to subject you, unless there is popular demand, to intense legal analysis of international treaties or otherwise. Can I just say, for those of you who may be interested in finding out more on the nitty-gritty, I would commend the expert report prepared for the Oireachtas, in fact, by Dr. Caroline Sweeney, Senior Parliamentary Researcher on the Defence Amendment Bill 2025, briefing paper in the Oireachtas Library and Research Service, because I think you will probably not have any doubts about anything really factual when you've finished reading her paper. It is magnificent. Can I just say that we're in a room which is redolent with history. 1707, this building commenced under construction. And over the fireplace, over the mantelpiece there, is a portrait of Wolfe Tone. And in 1798, in fact, this building was used by the British Army to billet troops to put down the rising at that time. So you're shifting uncomfortably in your seats at the memory of who was here in this room before you. But more cheerfully, much later, and I suppose I tell this story in response to the question earlier about how can we mobilize people, especially young people. So I offer this story in that context. And it's that in 1965, a young woman in her early 20s came into this room of a dark winter's evening, and she was coming in to the annual general meeting of the Wolfe Tone Society. She had recently returned from working in Italy, and she wanted to do something political with a small p that would be of some value. And she was looking around, and she heard about this society, and she thought, right, I might join them or suss them out. So she got in touch, and she's told to come to the AGM in Taylor's Hall, 1965. And she thought to herself, okay, I'll go in because it'll be an AGM, there'll be lots of people there, I'll be able to sneak in the back, and if I get bored, I'll be able to leave and nobody will notice, and I'll go on to the next possible group. So she walks in through the doors there at the back, and there's a different layout in 1965. There's a big long wooden table up and down the room, surrounded by these high-backed chairs. And around the big table sit 5 men. She had no escape prospect. She had to sit down. They all turned and looked at her when she came in. And so she sat down on one of the chairs, and the proceedings continued until they reached the point of nominations for next year's committee. And the man beside her, who she did not know from Adam, sprang to life and said, I propose the lady on my right. And that was it. She never looked back. So Muriel Sadlier told me that story, who's now 90, yesterday evening in an Indian restaurant in Drumcondra with her husband, Tony Coughlin. And to me, it just encapsulates an Irish version of the butterfly flapping its wings in Kansas, because we all have a right to vote in this country now on significant changes to EU treaties because really of Muriel and Tony and friends and allies that they made along the way, Raymond Crotty being one, and so on, which came together in a collaborative effort to persuade the Supreme Court back in '87 that the government wasn't in fact a free agent to commit the country to whatever it chose to commit the country to, but that it was operating within the constraints of Bunreacht na hÉireann, and it was a body which had to have respect to the rules in the Constitution when it came to matters of national import. And that is ultimately the rationale for the Supreme Court decision, made, interestingly, not on economic issues or arguments, but on the issues of then nascent foreign policy moves at EU level. And so here we are now, 40 years later, seeing how that has played out. And I think there was a good question earlier from someone who asked whether that Irish, uniquely Irish restraint of needing popular assent to changes had been a factor in how the EU and Ireland had worked out its relations on this issue, and the nature of that entire relationship. So I think that I offer that, as I say, as an illustration of you never know what your actions are going to lead to. That's my essential point. So try it and see where it goes. And my second, I suppose, illustration in response to the question of popular support is the not alone the I would say probably the exuberance among young people supporting President Higgins throughout his time. I never saw anything like the excitement and the enthusiasm. I had 4 younger children then, I suppose, 14 years ago, and among their peer group and so on. The level of excitement and idealism that is in the country cannot be underestimated as a natural resource, and it is there to be tapped. And I think that, of course, then when we had the counting of the vote in November, in October, and the inauguration in November of President Catherine Connolly, we saw President Connolly, renowned for her sporting skills, score a hat-trick in Irish electoral history, the largest percentage of the first preference vote, the greatest ever margin of victory in a presidential election, and the greatest raw number of votes ever in a presidential election. And we shouldn't forget that. You know, there are those who were opposed to these types of voices who would prefer that we forget about these things, and who don't like having them discussed particularly or much written about in newspapers. But I think these are the sources of our hope and our future charting of our course, if we want to chart our course in a way that is different to the profit-seeking motives of those who have other views. This is the third example I'll give, a more local example, which is it can be difficult sometimes to persuade people to become involved in reading reports and in analysing policy and coming up with alternative proposals for resolutions on mind-numbing matters before Parliament. But the Stop the Game initiative here in Ireland, for example, as Rory reminded me earlier, is an illustration of how people know instinctively what is right or what is wrong, and they will rally around an initiative which they can identify with, which captures that essence. And there is a magnificent book, I have to say, by Sally Hayden, which is recently published 2 weeks ago. This is also a love story. Sally is speaking tonight, I think, at the Dalkey Book Festival later on this evening. And in it, as a 23-year-old journalist, as she was then, she went to Rwanda and spoke to a woman who was called Zula Karuhimbi. And Zula was unusual and of interest to Sally because she had risked her life to save people who were then being slaughtered by the opposing tribes in Rwanda. And she was hiding some of them in her hut. And she had a bit of a reputation as a witch. And she used that quite creatively at the time. By any time the lads would come around with the machetes looking for more people to kill, she would come out with various herbs and stinging nettles and things wrapped around her hands and frighten all these men away, saying, "There's nobody here, and if you come nearer, you know I'm a witch." But the essence of the point that I think Sally extracted, who was a brilliant journalist and communicator, was that Zula did this in a way that I probably best do justice to by describing it in Sally's own words. She told me that she had acted selflessly during the genocide because it was the only behavior that made sense to her. So it makes sense to her, makes sense to us. She held my hand in hers as she spoke. We are one. Our forefathers and foremothers are one for all of us. We are siblings to each other. And I suppose we've heard different examples earlier today, all to the effect that they are the minority and we are the majority, and they know that and they're afraid of us. And all kinds of tactics are deployed, down to extinguishing voices in academia and so on, to try to achieve the results that the profit seekers want to achieve. And of course the figures are mind-boggling. I mean, I learned last week, it's always good to learn these things, the difference between a million and a billion. A million minutes ago is about 2 years ago. So think of a million minutes, and that's 2 years. But a billion, which is 1,000 million, a billion is back to the start of the Christian era calendar. That's back 2,000 years, okay? So when figures like billions are being thrown around, as we were, and even into trillions, I don't know how far back a trillion would bring you, but the amounts are ginormous. And we have the letter from the American ambassador to the Taoiseach of the day here a couple of years ago, Ambassador Claire Cronin, who was appointed by Biden, who was writing to the Taoiseach, I am closely following developments related to the Occupied Territories Bill. As our colleagues in Washington, we are concerned that if enacted in its current form, the bill would cause economic uncertainty for the almost 1,000 US companies operating in Ireland, because the US Export Administration Act prohibits US companies from complying with an unsanctioned foreign boycott. I encourage your teams to conduct thorough due diligence on the bill's potential impact to avoid any unforeseen consequences that could detract from what you hope to achieve with this legislation. My team is happy to connect your Attorney General and enterprise teams with the relevant offices in Washington for discussions to ensure the best outcome. Best, Claire. And you know the consequences of that kind of letter, okay? I mean, we owe that to the ditch that we actually get to see the letter. So that's where we are. We are where Wolfe Tone once was, and where the soldiers trying to put down the rising of 1798 once billeted, where Muriel Sadlier once came in and had a sense of being trapped, but has since flapped the butterfly wings to considerable extent and effect throughout the place. And I think that I'd probably close with a second reference to Sally Hayden's book, because she's a woman, mid-30s. She's written extensively, as we know, from Beirut, for example, in the Irish Times, but also previously from Rwanda, from Ukraine, from Japan, from many parts of the world troubled and otherwise by natural or human resource rows and wars and catastrophes. And in the close to her book, she talks about something, I think, which is very real, and we feel it even in this room, a sense of detachment. A sense of detachment. People are cut off from any sense of controlling their own community or the future of their own country, for example. We're lucky in this country still, as we heard from our colleagues from across the water, to the extent to which Irish people are still engaged and still do feel ownership. And that's very precious, and we must remember that. It is very unusual, and make use of it as best we can. But Sally Hayden still talks about this sense of detachment. We heard figures earlier about the trust in media going down and so on as arms expenditure goes up. We know correlation isn't causation, but there is that sense of what can I do? And I've tried to give some examples of people who went past that gatepost. But Hayden, in describing that problem, then in a way, in her epilogue, has to confront it for herself, because she says she has to deal with this. And she comes to a conclusion, which will be my conclusion, because she describes how somehow, despite all the bad things that are happening, her book, this is also a love story, takes its insight from the realization that dawned on her that all the headlines are about the bad things, but actually what keeps us all going is love. That is the story that's untold. And in telling the story, in my respectful submission, quite brilliantly in her book, she then has to face this in a very personal way herself, realizing all these bad things are happening, and that her idealistic idea of being a journalist, because she did a BCL first in UCD, corporate law was not for Sally Hayden, so she went into journalism, and then confronted with the realization that simply telling people what's going on actually isn't enough. Okay, so she addresses that complex problem in the epilogue to the book. But I'm going to just close with one short reading from it, which is that somehow, she said, despite all the bad things that happen, somehow humans manage to lay laughter over trauma and love over inhumanity. I considered the improbability of it all, how we suddenly appear here, blobs of consciousness, hurtling along for a limited time, expected to reside together amid chaos and brutality. We may be born and die alone, but our lives can still be measured in the love we bear and the connections we form, the ways people support each other. That is at least one wonderful truth. And really, that's the message that I think sustains me and sustains many of us in the teeth of what seems at times, and certainly tries itself for its own reasons, to give the impression of being overwhelming and untouchable, beyond our reach. It isn't. So keep going. Thank you very much.